Hello, I'm Gus Downing, the publisher and editor of the D&D Daily, and this is the LP News Network. We're here today at the Loss Prevention Research Council's Precision LP Impact Conference being held at the University of Florida from October 2nd to October 4th, 2017. This episode today is the 6th in a series of 7 episodes designed to give you a thorough understanding of the only team-driven LP and AP academic effort in retail history. We hope you watch the entire series and learn how an academic approach is helping LP and AP impact the total retail enterprise. We'd also like to thank CAM Connections, a division of ADT, for having the vision and commitment to the industry for sponsoring the entire series, and we'd like to invite you to thank them directly by visiting their website or pinging them on social media. So let's get started. Today's session is entitled The LPRC's Command and Control, the SOCLab Operations, which stands for Security Operations Center Lab Operations. With us today to discuss it is Fred Becker, Corporate Director of Loss Prevention for Bloomingdales, and Tom Meehan, Chief Strategy Officer and Chief Information Security Officer at CONTROLTEK USA. Tom was also at Bloomingdales, working with Fred for a number of years. Gentlemen, can you talk about how the LPRC is working to support strategic crisis and investigative operations?
Sure. Well, I think the first step was, as we collaborated together, we just had to identify a need, right? So at the end of the day, we were looking at what is the communication structure needed for in today's world. So we have a lot of things that are happening out there, from weather events like hurricanes, and how do we communicate with the field? How does the corporate people that need to make decisions, how do they know what's happening? All the way to different types of violent events, what's occurring in the stores, and how do we communicate and make decisions? So what we did as a group with the LPRC, we looked at what are the needs of each retailer, and we noticed that they're all different. And then what kind of infrastructure needed to be in place, what kind of best practices or best ideas would we start to look at?
Mm-hmm. From a security operations standpoint, of getting the information to the C-level executives as quickly and efficiently and accurately as possible, right, with the use of technology.
Exactly. At the end of the day, it's all about communication, right? It's taking the communication and finding out what's happening out there in the world real time, and being able to get that to the decision makers.
Right.
Yeah.
So that you can then take that information, get it back to the field with instructions, operations, and procedures, and just directions.
Right. In some cases, you're pushing the information back out, and then it's going back through this SOC.
So, and you have a couple of those in operation now?
So yeah, we have one in the LPRC lab, and Tom was instrumental in getting that up and running, and then Tom and I together initiated one and put one together in Bloomingdales. And what we did is we created one in our flagship store, which is where we have 24/7 staffing, et cetera. So today what we do is we use that from an investigative perspective, 24/7. And then also that doubles as an emergency operations center. So it's our EOC. So anything that happens out in the field goes through that, and when we activate it, we just change what we're using it for to help manage an event.
Now, have you worked with Walmart or Home Depot and those organizations? I mean, they have a very effective and rather large scale EOC. Yes. With the hurricanes and such.
So one of the things that we did is, with the working groups for the LPRC, the SOCLab innovation change is a subgroup of the innovations group. And the members are comprised of the folks that you mentioned right there. Additional there are some law enforcement, federal and local, and then some technology providers that are also members. And the really great part about this innovation team is it veers into true special operations centers, or EOCs, or emergency operations centers, where it's a good mix of asset protection professionals and then retail professionals that maybe not are in the asset protection department. So for instance, some of the members work for a completely different department. They might work for risk, but it's getting everyone together and coming up with best practices. And then working similar to what we do everything else with local and federal law enforcement and FEMA and some of those folks to establish best practice for the industry. And with everything that's going on between the civil disturbance, the weather events, and the unfortunate shootings, there's more of a need now than ever. And today the technology exists to make it a lot easier to get that information, disseminate it down to the lowest level, and also communicate it to the highest level at the same time, so that people can make good decisions. And we're talking about saving lives here, so these are decisions that are difference of loss or life or not. So we're coming up with best practices throughout the industry. And Fred mentioned it before, there isn't a one size fits all. So you mentioned all the big guys. So there are a lot of companies that don't have these big EOCs, yet have the same needs. So part of the solutions chain that we're doing for the SOCLab is, how do you get a vendor to work with a retailer, or a retailer that has a department of 4. They have a whole bunch of stores, but they really have a small footprint from an asset protection department. How can they harness technology? And they might not have a big room with a whole bunch of monitors, but they need to consume that same information, communicate it the same way. So how do we come up with the best practice that kind of suits both? Because the way you collect the data doesn't change. It's really what you do with the data that changes in size. So is a human going to look at everything, or are you going to use automation and software to help disseminate that information? And then arguably it all starts with having a really good plan of how you consume it, and then what you do with it, and then how you communicate it.
Right. And the decision tree after you have it.
Absolutely.
And is that something you're also working on standardization with?
Yeah, so the innovation chain itself, we call it the 3Ds. It really talks about detecting data, defining the data, and then deciding with the data. And the way I look at it is, when you talk about detection of data, it's about where you're going to consume the information from. So whether it's traditional news sources, your daily letter is a source that we would use in the lab to help gather information. We look at blogs, we look at social media, we look at weather. So it's virtually any open source intelligence data that's available that we would bring in. So that's part of that detect stage. The next piece is, all right, I have this data, how do I consume it? So do I have a human looking at it? Do I have software that helps me disseminate it? Depending on the size of my department and my store chain, what specific data do I need that someone else might not need? So for instance, in my past life, we didn't really have tornadoes. We didn't have that issue. We didn't have stores in those areas. So we wouldn't be focused on the same thing as someone who has stores in the Midwest where they're going to have that issue. So the practice really is about consuming the right data for you, the right amount of data, and then in that detect phase, it's getting that information. The define phase is, all right, I have this information. What does it mean? So is it valid? We often find, and Fred and I worked together at Bloomingdales, and we saw this time after time, that the first news reports are inaccurate. And sometimes they're grossly inaccurate. And if you go back even 5 years ago, that was all you had. So you're making a decision and literally sitting there going, I'm going to make this decision that could potentially have a life impact, and I'm not really sure it's the right decision, but if I don't do anything, I'm in big trouble. Today, you fast forward and you can, in that define phase, through social media, through live streaming, through news, you can pretty accurately depict exactly what's occurring real time. And then you go to the decide phase. And the decide phase is arguably the most important. It's kind of, I refer to it as the tipping point. And you're literally taking the two approach. You're hitting, what am I going to tell my C-suite? And what and how am I going to communicate to the field? Both at the same time. So it could be in a weather event, it could be as simple as an early closing. But with all of that data today, you can take a different approach. Years ago, you'd look at the weather. Now you can actually see live cameras where the weather is and make sure that you're closing your store at the appropriate time. And then you can take the other extreme where there may be an active shooter that's 3 blocks away from a store. What do I do? How quickly do I need to disseminate that information? Because what you don't want to do is you don't want to give misinformation and scare people, but you want to give the appropriate information as timely as possible. At the same time, you got to be communicating with that C-suite. So you have to have a template or a system and process already defined in how you're going to communicate to the C-suite. And when I say the template, it is actually one of the things that we're learning through the SOC innovation chain is the big guys. They can consume data better than anybody, arguably better than some of the governmental agencies. They go in and they go, wow, you guys have lots of, but what they struggle with is how do I disseminate that information to the field and to the C-suite and to PR all at the same time. So where the first two portions, that detect, is no problem, that define is no problem, but the decide piece is what they need help on. You'll find with some of the smaller folks, it's the opposite. where they know how to communicate it to their fields. They live with their C-suites right next to them, but they have challenges bringing that information in and what we're doing. So what we're focused on today is what's a best practice that covers the whole industry, and what the great part is, again, that collaboration with federal law enforcement, local law enforcement, FEMA, your technology providers, and your retailers all in a group sharing ideas, what the LPRC is about, trying to solve the bigger problem. And the evolution is changing dramatically. I think every week we hear a different way someone's doing something. And I think if you'd asked 3 or 4 years ago, they would say social media, social media, social media. And now folks are starting to realize that social media is becoming part of everyday life. And what's social media? Social media, in a lot of ways, is taking your traditional media source and just bring it to another platform. And when you look at it, like when you're looking at social media and it's coming from a major news network or from the D&D Daily, it's not social media. Social media is distributing it, right, but it's consumption of traditional media a different way. So how do we help make that easy? And keeping in mind the thing that we're always talking about is with those 3Ds is this is a place where if you have too much coming in, you can't get through it. So it's what's the right amount of information for you, and that's why I use that weather example. You're not going to consume data that doesn't affect you. You're not going to look for things. Fred and I live in the Northeast. If you're in an area that it never snows, you're not going to focus on all of the things related to snow. It's those type of things. Unfortunately, on the other side, active shooters, civil disturbance, all those things are real today and happening all the time. So you have to have that in front of mind at all times.
Well, the issue would be when do you activate it? For the smaller and medium-sized companies, they don't have the staffing and the payroll to have this 24/7 ready to go at any moment. For the small and medium retailers, they've got to have another trigger in there is when you start the process.
Well, I think that that was part of the process. When we started looking at putting together the SOC for Bloomingdale's, we had to have a starting place. And it's just what were our needs, right? So some retailers may take a conference room and just put the equipment in there and the resources, and they don't touch it until there's an incident. And then you mentioned Walmart and some of the biggers, they may have a need for a 24/7. But to simplify, to try and figure out what our needs were, we had to look at it, okay, who wants information for what and when? So that was a starting point, and we kind of looked at it in 3 different phases. Once we determined what could we possibly need, what questions could possibly ask, or what information, that kind of determined how we set it up from a physical standpoint, right? What tools, resources, et cetera. And then the second piece was a process. And that's going to probably vary a lot by location, by the type of information needed, what process. And that could be the hierarchy that gets the information, how the information is gotten. So that's the second piece, and we put that together. And the third, once you have all that, then you need to practice, right? Tabletop exercises, and we've done that with several of those types of events because we want to get it right. We want to make sure that in going through that process, we identified, okay, this group didn't get the information they need. Let's go at it again. So that was a very important step as well.
And I would imagine that the relationship with the solution providers and the 60 groups that are members of the LPRC is very beneficial for you from a standpoint of making sure that that technology chain, if I can use your phrase, that they're keeping it up to date, you're getting the latest and the greatest, and you're using it, you're able to use it in this lab. So that's got to be a real benefit for you.
Yeah, and so speaking for both sides, because I sat on the retail side for 20 years and now I'm on the other side, I think that the LPRC and like this conference, the Impact Conference, it's the perfect place where you might have an idea as a solution provider, but you really need that partnership or the collaboration with the retailer or a group of retailers to help seal, okay, well, I was thinking it should be this way. Now that I'm talking to you, run through. And through the SOCLab, a lot of that's come up. And your question, and Fred talked about just before, is we have folks that are members of the LPRC that specialize in how do we take data and make it easier for you to consume it. And again, the best practice principle is really all-encompassing in how can we answer that question for everybody. And that, there's a cheat sheet, if you will, and that's kind of like when we talk about the 3Ds. It's not a one-size-fits-all, but if you went through that, arguably today, everybody in the room could take that and have a starting point and have a process to follow. It's still going to take a lot of practice and massaging and working through it. The other thing that's really different today than when Fred and I started, I want to say it was 2011 when we started having the conversation. So we started, Fred and I at Bloomingdales a while ago. Today, the capability from a mobile standpoint is drastically different than 6 years ago. So you could essentially run our complete Bloomingdales or EOC from an iPad, 100%. You can consume everything from your phone or from a device. So that helps a lot of the smaller retailers understand that it is overwhelming when you think of, I'm going to go in this, this huge room with all these seats. I don't even have people to fill the seats. If I had the resources to get this room, what would I do with it? So the great part about it today is that really depending on your footprint and your resources, you can tailor it to work. It's a matter of that pre-planning and really sitting down and identifying what's the best solution for my organization. And then what do we want to get out of it? If you're going to try to create a SOC or an EOC that to solve all of your problems, not going to work. And when you activate an EOC or a SOC in any environment, generally it's going to be a severe event that whether it's those examples that we talked about, whether it's a weather event, and if you think of all the hurricanes recently, that are, all of those are when you're really activating it, regardless of what size you are. And activating is kind of a buzzword. It could just be you going, I got to pull this up and I got to start planning to communicate. And I have my plan here. I can go through my checklist. I'm going to follow these 5 steps, then I'm going to go to here, and then I'm going to get to that decide phase and communicate it.
From an evolutionary standpoint, do you see it getting to the point where there's going to be a standardized type of response mechanisms out there for the retail industry where maybe, if you're not big enough to have one, there's solution providers that will provide it, and here's the book for the industry? Do you see it evolving there?
I would think that there will be a template. Again, I think everyone will have their different take on that. But I think as you start to identify the tools and resources, and that's the advantage of an LPRC, right? Because we're partnering, we're learning from other retailers and solution providers, and they're learning from us. I think you'll see it more congruent. You'll see a lot more similarities. It makes us all better. But I think there'll always be some differences.
Yeah, certainly. But at least there would be a tool there, or a planogram, so to speak, for the other retailers that are smaller to be able to plug into and benefit from. Last night, or with the Las Vegas incident, they talked about how fast the law enforcement responded, and they were there in a matter of minutes. Obviously that's a well-trained unit, and they did a great job and such, but their security operations center, which is what they are, so to speak, worked marvelously. So, and how do you deliver that to the entire retail industry so that, the whole industry is able to respond that quick, that effectively, and minimize loss of life or product, or even stores for that matter. Right. So, that was my point there.
Yeah, and that's what we're doing at the lab,
yeah,
right?
Great work. Yeah. Gentlemen, thanks for being here today.
Thank you, guys.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's it for this episode. We'd like to thank you for watching, and we hope you watch the next episode as we talk about making a real difference at the LPRC Impact Conference. And we talk to the actual working group action team and hear about their breakout session and what makes it different than the rest. And once again, we'd like to thank KM Connections, a division of ADT, for sponsoring the entire series. So until next time, let's keep them all safe out there.